It was actually at Sussex University in the 1960s that I became a creationist. And this is Professor John Maynard Smith. I don't know if you're familiar with his name. People like Richard Dawkins get all the fame and fortune, but people like Maynard Smith are the real workers in the field of evolution, and he was one of the world's leading evolutionists. He actually won prizes equivalent to the Nobel Prize for his contribution to evolutionary theory. Now, I didn't realize that when I went to Sussex University. It was, those of you who are old enough to know, a very kind of avant-garde place in the 1960s. It had only just opened. It was very kind of radical. It had radical students doing all sorts of things that got themselves into the newspapers. I didn't think of myself as a very radical person. I went up to university as a Christian, but as a convinced evolutionist. And I don't know why I was an evolutionist. I don't know where I learnt it. I kind of absorbed it from the culture, but I was absolutely certain that evolution was a fact. Although I was also a Christian, this didn't give me a problem. I just filed them somehow in two separate parts of myself, and there was no conflict. Didn't think about it. When I did A-level zoology, that was the first time I was presented with evidence for evolution, and I realize now it was the standard evidences, the sort of things that's in Origin of Species, but I actually found it very unconvincing. This didn't throw me. I knew evolution was a fact. I thought it was simply that the evidence was too complex for an A-level student to grasp, and that someone else had the evidence, the real evidence. It's interesting that, though, isn't it? That even as a 17-year-old schoolgirl who didn't see this as an issue, it struck me that the evidence was not convincing, that the sorts of stuff that was being put forward was capable of more than one interpretation. But I arrived at Sussex University, John Maynard Smith, in the first year of the biology department. John Maynard Smith was the dean of the School of Biological Sciences. It was only a small group of us. We had personal contact with him. It was a great, great privilege. And he in fact lectured me on evolution and on the evidences for evolution. And now that I know what a famous and special person he was, I look back on it and think, I'm so glad I went there. I really do. And I really honor his memory, because it was a very good place to be. We were encouraged to follow the evidence where it leads. It was a radical cutting-edge course. It had done away with all the just chopping things up in the lab to focus on genetics and biochemistry and neurophysiology and all the sorts of things that interested me. And it was a rigorous training. We were taught to critique everything. You didn't just accept what anybody said. They had to prove it to you. You had to, and I'm not that kind of person, really. I found this side of it difficult. In the seminars, they were telling us, no, don't just accept what we've just told you. Criticize it, ask questions, And I did my best. But one day I had a great shock. This was towards the end of my 3 years, towards the end of my BSc course. I found that we were told we had to follow the evidence where it led, except if you queried evolution. Now remember, I was myself an evolutionist, and I'd met some creationists in the Christian Union. I didn't think much of them. Well, I thought they were nice people, but I didn't think much of their position because they weren't biologists. I thought they just don't know what they're talking about, and I didn't really pay them much attention, but I suppose it did niggle me a little bit. And one day I was in a seminar where we were discussing the evolution of the vertebrate eye, and obviously if evolution is true, and if it's followed the course that it's supposed to have followed, from molecules up through very simple creatures to multicellular creatures to invertebrates to vertebrates, then the eyes have to follow that same course. I mean, the whole creature has to evolve from one step to the next. It can't do it in bits, can it? Well, that was the concept. So you can't have one part of it evolving and another not. So it had to evolve from an invertebrate type eye to a vertebrate type eye. And that's what we were discussing in this seminar. But as we talked round and round in circles on it, well, I didn't say much, I just listened to the others. It was clearly impossible because the two systems work on completely different basic principles. So eventually I said, well, if we can't see how it's happened, perhaps we should question whether it has happened. And I was absolutely astonished at the response that I got, because there was a shocked silence. There'd been a lot of, debate and noise, and the place went completely silent. And somebody began to mock me for believing in God. I hadn't mentioned God. I hadn't actually really thought about him when I said this. The person leading the seminar, who up to then had been gentle and encouraging and trying to get us all to say as much as possible, said in a very harsh and sort of decisive way, I remember his words, "I'm not going to get involved in any controversy. Stop." And so for the very first time, I was silenced. Creationists are silenced. And here I wasn't even a creationist, and I was already being silenced. And that, I'm afraid, has been the pattern ever since. The evidence is not allowed to lead you away from evolution. It's okay as long as it leads in the right direction, but not if you challenge the idea of evolution itself. And so the ideological nature of evolutionary theory was revealed to me in a flash. I thought, this is different. This is not the science we've been trained in. And although I probably couldn't have articulated it at that time, I saw evolution for what it was, not essentially a scientific theory, although it does include science, obviously. And it's interesting, though, that was in 1968, probably early 1968 or late 67. 10 years later, papers began to come out by prestigious scientists saying, you probably know this, the eye has evolved 40 different times or 20 different times. They had come to that conclusion. The evidence in the end had forced them to that conclusion, and they had abandoned the whole scheme of whereby one evolved into another and began to say that it evolved 20 different times. So that was the way of reconciling evolutionary theory with what the evidence actually was. And that, again, reveals its ideological nature, you see. There's a guy called David Stove. He's a bit infamous. He's dead now, I think, but he was a philosopher, and he's written a book called Darwinian Fairy Tales. He's not a Christian, or wasn't a Christian as far as I know, certainly not a creationist. But in his book, Darwinian Fairy Tales, he describes animal behavior which doesn't fit with Darwinian thought at all. And then he says, such cases, I need hardly say, never bother armour-plated neo-Darwinians, but then no cases, possible or even actual, ever do bother them. In neo-Darwinism's house, there are many mansions. So many, indeed, that if a certain awkward fact still will not fit into one mansion, then it is sure to be another one into which it will fit to admiration. And that's what happened, you see, with this eye thing. They came up with a different explanation. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but it reveals there's nothing wrong with it unless you were saying that evolution is purely and simply a scientific theory. If you're admitting that it's not, that it's actually a religious idea, essentially, an ideological idea, then that is the way such a thing operates, of course. So this was confirmed for me, really. Well, it has been many times over in the past 40 years. But you can see for yourselves an interview with John Maynard Smith conducted in 2001. If you just Google John Maynard Smith, you will find this very easily under this thing, meaning of life.tv/video, you'll find him. And this is what he says. It's a long interview, but the interviewer asks him, how did you first come to believe in evolution? And he says, I remember reading Darwin when I was at school. I'd been raised in the Church of England. Reading Darwin, I thought, this is an alternative explanation. Philosophical and religious implications first got me excited. It was an enormous relief to escape from religion. Now that's very similar to what Richard Dawkins will say. He actually says almost exactly the same thing. that in his teens at school, it was such a relief to him to be able to turn to Darwinism and abandon religion. So you see, the religious, semi-religious, ideological nature of Darwinism is revealed there in two of its chief exponents. So what is Darwinism then? Well, listen to this from Maynard Smith, again from the same interview. You can ask exactly the same questions of a bird's wing as of a piece of engineering. In the case of the engineering, you ask, why did the designer make it like that? In the case of the bird's wing, you ask, why did natural selection make it like that? The kind of thinking you do is exactly the same. Natural selection and design produce the same results.